I've hiked plenty of trails, but mountains have always had a way of humbling me in ways I never expect. They look so still from a distance, like solid monuments that never change. But once you're on them, you realize how alive they are, how the weather shifts in minutes, how the terrain can betray you with one bad step, how quickly you can go from confident to scared. One trip in particular stays with me, not because it was the hardest trail I've ever done, but because it was the first time I felt real fear settle into my bones on a mountain. It was late summer when I set out, and the forecast had promised clear skies. I started early, the kind of morning where the air is crisp and cool, the sun just beginning to burn mist off the lower slopes. My pack was stocked. Food, water, layers, a map, and a headlamp in case I took longer than expected. The trail wound up the mountain in switchbacks, climbing through thick trees before breaking open into rocky stretches with views of valleys spreading out far below. I remember thinking it felt good to be moving, my legs strong, the steady rhythm of climbing filling me with a kind of calm. The first few hours were uneventful. I passed a couple of day hikers on their way down, but by mid-morning I was alone. The trail grew rougher the higher I went. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, and patches of dirt had been worn smooth and slick from other hikers. The trees thinned, replaced by scrubby brush and exposed stone. The air was thinner, cooler, sharper. I could see for miles in every direction, the ridges rolling away like waves frozen in place. But mountains have a way of changing on you without warning. It started with the wind. One moment it was calm, the next it was tearing across the ridge, strong enough to push me sideways if I didn't brace myself. Clouds rolled in from nowhere, gray and heavy, swallowing the sun and dimming the world around me. The trail that had seemed open and bright was suddenly shadowed, the temperature dropping fast enough that I had to pull my jacket from my pack. I should have turned back then. I knew weather could change fast up high, but I was stubborn. I told myself it was just a passing cloud, that I'd be fine, so I kept climbing. The trail narrowed along a steep slope, one side dropping away into a sheer fall, the other side a wall of jagged rock. My steps grew careful, my breathing louder in the silence. The wind howled, rattling loose stones that tumbled down the drop-off. That's when the unease really set in. Not panic, not yet, but that prickling sense that something was wrong. The mountain didn't feel still anymore. It felt watchful, like it was waiting to see what mistake I would make. The silence between gusts of wind was thick, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the sound of my own breath. The trail twisted again, leading me into a stretch of boulders that required scrambling. I hauled myself up with my hands, gripping cold rock, testing each step before committing. Halfway across, a sound echoed, a deep crack, sharp and sudden. For a split second, I thought it was thunder, but it was closer, heavier. I froze, my palms pressed flat against stone, my heart hammering. A rock above me shifted loose, clattering down past my shoulder and bouncing into the drop below. I had to move carefully after that. Every rock seemed unstable, every foothold suspect. My arms ached from gripping, my knees scraped against the stone. By the time I pulled myself out of that section, my nerves were frayed raw. I was sweating even in the cold, my shirt sticking to my back. The storm didn't wait. The clouds thickened, dropping lower, until the ridge was swallowed in mist. My visibility shrank to a few yards in front of me. The trail blurred, edges fading into white nothingness on either side. The wind carried drops of rain that stung against my face. My map felt useless in that fog. I knew the general direction, but one wrong turn could put me off the trail entirely. I slowed down, moving step by cautious step, shining my headlamp even though it was still day. The beam cut only a small hole through the mist, lighting up rocks slick with rain. Every sound carried strangely, echoing off stone and vanishing into fog. More than once I thought I heard movement, a shuffle of gravel, the crunch of steps that weren't mine. But when I stopped, everything was silent except the wind. That silence worked on me more than the storm did. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Not by an animal. I've heard animals in the wild before. This felt different, too steady, too deliberate. But when I looked back, There was only mist and the vague outline of the trail I'd already crossed. Hours passed like that, or at least it felt like hours. I don't know how long I actually wandered in the fog, but time stretched and twisted until all I knew was the sound of my own boots and the weight of fear sitting like a stone in my stomach. At one point, I found myself at the edge of a slope I didn't recognize, the trail gone, the ground dropping sharply into nothing. My headlamp beam fell into emptiness, and I realized how easy it would be to step forward and vanish without a sound. That thought snapped me into focus. I forced myself to sit down, breathing hard, gripping the straps of my pack to ground myself. I couldn't let the mountain trick me into rushing, into panicking. Slowly, carefully, I backtracked, keeping one hand against the wall of rock beside me until I found the faint scrape of boot prints in the mud. My own trail. I followed them, hunched against the wind, until at last I stumbled back onto the switchbacks leading down. Descending was worse in some ways. My legs trembled with exhaustion, every step threatening to give out. The rain made the trail slick, and more than once I slid a few feet before catching myself. The mist thinned only slightly, giving me glimpses of trees below, shadows swaying in the storm. But I kept moving, one foot after another, until the slope eased and the forest swallowed me again. By the time I reached the bottom, night had fallen. My SUV sat alone in the gravel pull-off, wet and glistening under my headlamp. I threw my pack inside and collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I had to sit still before I could even turn the key. The mountain loomed above, its peak hidden in storm clouds, dark and silent again as if nothing had happened. I made it out fine, but I've never forgotten the way it felt up there. The fear wasn't just of slipping or getting lost. It was the sense that the mountain itself had turned against me, as if it had decided I didn't belong and was testing whether I was strong enough to leave alive. I know it's just nature, unpredictable and uncaring, but in the moment it felt personal. That hike taught me more than any article or gear checklist ever could. Mountains don't need to be dramatic to kill you. They don't need to roar or shake or strike. All they have to do is wait for you to make one mistake. Step the wrong way, ignore the signs, push a little too far. That day, I walked away shaken, humbled, and with a new respect burned into me. Because on a mountain, the line between feeling alive and not coming back at all is thinner than you ever want to realize when you're standing there in the fog. I've been on a lot of trails in my life, and most of them blend together. Long stretches of dirt winding through trees, the crunch of boots on gravel, the smell of pine needles or dry grass depending on where I am. Most of the time, hiking is peaceful, predictable. You get tired, you sweat, you push through, and you go home with sore legs and maybe a blister or two. But every now and then, something happens that sticks. Not because it's dramatic in the usual sense, but because it unsettles you in a way you can't quite shake. This happened on a trail I'd done before, nothing remote or dangerous. It was the kind of place where families went on weekends, where people jogged or walked their dogs. I'd gone there plenty of times with my own dog, a sturdy, medium-sized mutt who was usually steady as a rock. He wasn't the type to spook at every squirrel or rustle in the brush. If anything, he was too brave for his own good, always trying to chase after things he had no business chasing. That day, though, something was different. It started off normally enough. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, not quite evening yet, but late afternoon. The air had that cool edge that comes right before dusk, when shadows start to stretch longer and the light turns golden. My dog trotted happily at my side, tongue out, tail up, ears flicking toward every sound in the undergrowth. There were a few other hikers earlier on the trail, but by the time I got deeper in, it had emptied out. The quiet settled in, broken only by the crunch of my boots, the steady panting of my dog, and the occasional call of a bird. We followed the trail along a ridge, where the ground sloped steeply off one side into a mess of thick brush and trees. It was the kind of area where you couldn't really see far off the trail. Everything below was shadowed and tangled. On the other side, the hillside rose upward, rocky and dotted with scraggly pines. It was a stretch I'd always thought of as a little eerie, mostly because of how silent it got there. No wind, no running water, no human noise, just stillness. About halfway through that section, my dog froze. One moment he was trotting along beside me, the next his whole body stiffened, ears pricked forward, hackles raised along his back. He stood there, head low, staring at the brush down the slope. I stopped too, assuming he'd spotted a deer or maybe another hiker off trail. I scanned the shadows, squinting, but I didn't see anything. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. Then he barked. Not his usual playful bark, not the sound he made when chasing after squirrels. This was sharp, deep, and angry, the kind of bark that comes from a place of real alarm. He lunged forward a step, then stopped, barking again, and then suddenly shrank back against my legs. His body was rigid, tail tucked hard under him, ears pinned back. He snarled once, then whimpered, then pressed into me so tightly that I nearly stumbled. It rattled me because this wasn't normal for him. He'd faced off with bigger dogs, loud machinery, even the occasional snake on the trail without acting like this. I crouched a little, trying to see what he saw, but my eyes found nothing but shadows between the brush. The hillside below the trail was too dense to see clearly. Every branch and tangle of leaves seemed to shift in the dim light, but nothing stood out. Still, my dog's behavior didn't let up. He'd surge forward a few feet, barking and growling, then retreat to hide behind me, trembling. He kept repeating this, caught between aggression and fear, as though he couldn't decide whether to fight or flee. His whole body shook against my legs. His eyes were locked on the same patch of brush the entire time, as if something was there, just beyond my sight. I stood rooted, every instinct telling me not to ignore him. Animals pick up things we miss. I strained my ears, trying to catch the faintest noise, footsteps, branches breaking, breathing, but the silence was thick. Even the birds had gone quiet. That, more than anything, set me on edge. The longer I stood there, the more wrong it felt. My dog wasn't calming down. If anything, his panic deepened, his growls turning into low, guttural rumbles that I could feel vibrating through his body. My own pulse picked up, pounding in my ears. It wasn't just nerves. It was that primal awareness that something wasn't right, that invisible weight pressing in on me, demanding that I listen. Finally, I made the decision. I tightened my grip on the leash and turned back the way we'd come. The second I moved, my dog bolted to follow, tail still tucked, still glancing over his shoulder every few steps. He didn't resist me once, which told me everything I needed to know. He wanted out of there just as badly as I did. We didn't run, but we moved fast. My eyes kept darting to the sides of the trail, scanning for movement, half expecting something to step out at any moment. The silence followed us, broken only by the sound of my dog's nails scraping against the dirt as he hurried along. My mouth had gone dry, and every breath felt shallow, like my body was on high alert even though I hadn't seen a single thing. By the time we reached the more open stretch of the trail, where the trees thinned and the light poured in again, I felt some of the tension leave me. My dog's body eased slightly, though his ears stayed back and his head kept swiveling as though making sure we weren't followed. Only after we'd put a good mile between us and that section did his tail lift again and his walk return to something like normal. I never saw anything on that trail that day. Not a deer, not a person, not even a shadow moving through the brush. But the way my dog reacted left no doubt in my mind that something had been there. Whether it was a predator watching us, another person lurking off trail, or something else entirely, I'll never know. What I do know is that dogs don't fake fear like that. He was responding to something real, something I wasn't able to sense. Even now, I think about it whenever I hike. The memory comes back strongest when I'm alone on a quiet stretch of trail, when the world feels just a little too still. I've been back to that area since, but I'll admit I never walk that ridge without picking up my pace. I always glance at that slope, half expecting to see something staring back up at me. That day taught me a simple rule I still follow without question. When your dog tells you something's wrong, you listen, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what you don't. It wasn't on a trail or deep in the woods, but in some ways that made it creepier. I always thought of hiking or camping as the places where unsettling things happened, far away from other people. But this night reminded me that even in your own neighborhood, with houses all around and streetlights casting their glow, you can stumble into a moment that makes you feel completely vulnerable. Back when we lived at our old place, my girlfriend and I used to walk the dogs every night. It was part of our routine. The neighborhood was nothing fancy. Rows of houses with narrow yards, street lamps spaced just far enough that the light left patches of shadow between them. A mix of quiet roads and little cul-de-sacs where people parked their cars along the curb. During the day it felt normal, safe even, but at night the place had a different atmosphere. The air cooled, the wind carried more sounds, and the shadows seemed thicker. We had 3 dogs at the time. 2 of them were younger, strong, always pulling at the leash, eager to sniff and explore everything. The third was older, a retired service dog, gentle and calm in most situations. He'd been trained to be steady, and even in his later years, he carried himself with a kind of quiet discipline. Other than stealing the ball during fetch, he had never shown an ounce of aggression. He was the dog everyone trusted, the one who got along with anyone, the one you'd expect to be last in line to ever growl at something. That night, I was walking the 2 younger dogs. They had energy to burn and were dragging me forward more than I was leading them. My girlfriend had the older one. We set out around the same time as always, heading down the block and looping around corners, sticking to the familiar paths. I ended up a little ahead of her, maybe 10 or 15 feet. Not far, but enough that when I rounded a corner, I couldn't see her in my peripheral vision anymore. I thought nothing of it. Later, she told me what happened in that short space of time. She had slowed down behind me, partly because she saw someone lingering nearby. At first, it just looked like a guy walking, but the longer she glanced, the more she realized he wasn't moving with purpose. He was hanging back, watching a house, almost like he was studying it. She said it looked like he was checking the place out, his attention locked on the windows and the door. That alone was enough to set off a little unease in her. But then he noticed her. When his eyes shifted and landed on her, he closed the distance. She said he greeted her casually, and she responded out of instinct, polite but guarded. She even asked how he was doing. She was trying to keep things normal, not wanting to seem nervous. But before he could even answer, the dog beside her reacted in a way neither of us had ever seen before. The older dog, the calmest of the 3, suddenly let out a deep growl. It wasn't a quick bark or a low grumble. It was a sound from his chest, steady and deliberate, directed at the man standing near them. For a dog that had spent his life calm and even-tempered, it was completely out of character. My girlfriend apologized automatically, telling the man that the dog was a guard dog. It was her way of brushing it off, but also of making it clear not to come closer. The man didn't get angry. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he looked at her and said something that made her blood run cold. That the dog was doing his job well tonight. That was when she cut the moment short, tugging the leash and hurrying up the sidewalk to catch up to me. By the time I heard her footsteps and looked back, I didn't know anything about what had just happened. She didn't say a word until much later, but I could tell from the way she walked, fast, stiff, with her head down, that something had shaken her. When she told me afterward, the details sat heavy with me. I kept replaying it in my head. A man out late, lingering around a house like he didn't belong there. The way the dog, of all dogs, had growled at him, breaking years of calm obedience. And then that comment, a line that felt more like acknowledgement than reassurance. It made my stomach twist to think how easily I could have been too far ahead to hear or notice if anything had happened. We finished that walk without another incident. The streets looked the same, the dogs pulled the same, but everything felt different. The shadows between streetlights seemed darker. Every yard we passed, every car parked along the curb, seemed like it could hide someone. The night wasn't the same routine anymore. It was loaded with the thought of what had almost happened. After that, we changed our habits. No more walking that late, no more splitting the dogs in a way that left one of us ahead or behind. We stuck closer together, kept a sharper eye on the streets around us. The older dog never reacted like that again, not once, but we both remembered that moment. If a dog who had seen everything and stayed calm through all of it felt the need to growl, there was a reason. Looking back, it was a tame incident compared to some stories you hear. Nothing happened. No confrontation, no chase, no violence. But that's exactly why it stuck with me. Sometimes the scariest things aren't what you see. They're the warnings you get, the subtle signs that something isn't right. That night, it was a dog breaking years of calm to tell us there was danger close enough to matter. We didn't see it play out, but we didn't need to. The message was clear enough. From then on, every time I walked those streets at night, I felt the weight of it. The sound of his growl never really left my ears. A reminder that even in familiar places, when you're close to home and think you're safe, you can still brush up against something that isn't. That was the night I realized how quickly normal can turn into uneasy, and how sometimes the only reason nothing worse happens is because of the warning you got in time. It happened years ago, but I still remember the unease that settled over me that night. It wasn't deep in the woods, it wasn't on some isolated trail. It was in my own neighborhood, a place I thought I knew well enough to feel safe in. That was probably the part that rattled me most. I'd been on late jogs before plenty of times and never had a reason to think twice about it. But that night reminded me that danger doesn't always look like danger when you first see it. I had gone out for a run late, really late. It was around 1 in the morning, the time when most people were asleep and the neighborhood looked deserted. I liked jogging at odd hours sometimes. The streets were empty, the air was cooler, and I didn't have to weave around cars or people. There was a rhythm to it. The sound of my shoes slapping the pavement, my breathing steady, the night air filling my lungs. The neighborhood itself was ordinary. Single-family homes lined the streets, driveways running up from the curb, porches dark except for the occasional porch light someone had forgotten to turn off. Street lamps stood every so often, spilling weak yellow light that left long shadows in between. Lawns stretched out in neat squares, and the silence was thick enough that the smallest noises carried far. I'd been running for a while, and eventually I slowed down to catch my breath. I stopped near a bend in the road, bent forward slightly, hands resting on my knees as I sucked in the cool night air. My pulse thumped in my ears. That's when I noticed him. To my right, just off the road, was a neighbor's driveway. Parked there was a car I recognized, one I'd passed dozens of times during the day. But crouched low next to the driver's side door was a man. He wasn't standing casually or walking up the driveway like he belonged there. He was low, tucked in close to the car, his body angled like he didn't want to be seen. At first, my brain didn't process it. I just stared, confused, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. He froze when he saw me, his body still but tense, like an animal caught in a beam of light. For a long second, neither of us moved. Just me standing in the middle of the quiet street, my breath heavy from running, and him crouched beside a car that wasn't his. I broke the silence first. Out of instinct, maybe out of some need to make things less strange, I said, "Hi." My voice sounded too loud in the still air. He looked at me for another moment and said hi back. His tone was awkward, clipped. He didn't stand up all the way, just shifted slightly, still crouched, his eyes flicking between me and the car. The exchange lasted no more than a few seconds, but it stretched in my head like it was longer. There was something about the way he moved, the way he avoided stepping into the open, that unsettled me. I didn't linger. I adjusted my posture, pretended like nothing was out of place, and started jogging again. I didn't look back until I'd put a good stretch of road between us. And when I did, the driveway looked empty in the dim glow of the street lamp. He was gone, either ducked behind the car or slipped off into the shadows. The rest of the run home, my thoughts churned. First, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he lived there. Maybe he dropped something near his car. Maybe he was just being weird about seeing someone at that hour. But the longer I replayed it, the clearer it became that he didn't belong there. His posture, the way he crouched, the way he froze when I saw him, none of it matched a person just going about their own business. By the time I got home, my breathing had steadied from the run, but my pulse hadn't settled. I locked the door behind me, leaned against it for a second, and thought about how easily that moment could have gone differently. If I had asked him what he was doing, if I had stopped to watch longer, if I had been closer, Later, when I thought about it again, the unease deepened. That driveway didn't belong to him. I knew the people who lived in that house by sight, and he wasn't one of them. The more I considered it, the more certain I became. He was crouched there because he was trying to get into the car. He was caught in the act, and the only thing that stopped him was me showing up at the wrong time. What stuck with me wasn't just the possibility of theft, but how normal it all felt in the moment. How easy it was to miss what was really happening right in front of me. I greeted him like he was a neighbor, and he greeted me back like nothing was out of the ordinary. For a few seconds, it was just two people exchanging a word on a quiet street. But underneath it was something darker, a reminder that not everyone you see out there at night is harmless. After that, I stopped jogging that late. The peace of the empty streets didn't feel the same anymore. Every shadow seemed heavier. Every figure in the distance made my chest tighten. The thought of stopping for air near another driveway filled me with unease. Looking back, I know I got lucky. I interrupted him without meaning to, and nothing came of it. But I also know how thin the line was between a quiet jog and something far worse. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens. It's what almost happened, what you only piece together afterward, when you realize just how close you were to something you never expected in a place you thought was safe. That night taught me that safety is fragile, and sometimes the strangest moments are the ones where nothing really happens at all because it easily could have. It was one of those late nights when the road just kept winding deeper into the mountains and every turn seemed darker than the last. My friends and I had decided to head up into the forest for a quick overnight. Nothing serious, just a short hike in and a spot to throw down tents. We didn't leave town until later than we should have, though, and by the time we were driving the dirt road that led toward the trailhead, it was already well past 10. The forest out there had no streetlights, no signs of people once you got past the last gas station miles back. The headlights cut narrow beams through the trees, but beyond that there was nothing but black shapes and shadows pressing against the car. The road felt like it went on forever, crunching gravel under the tires, branches occasionally reaching out low enough to scrape against the roof. Everyone was tired and quiet by then. The conversations we'd had earlier had trailed off, and now it was just the low hum of the engine and the occasional cough of dust catching in the headlights. I kept thinking about how strange it must look, a lone car moving up a deserted road into the woods at that hour. If anyone was out there camping nearby, they'd see our headlights long before they ever saw us. Eventually, we found a wide pull-off near a bend where the road narrowed. It wasn't a formal trailhead, just one of those flat patches of dirt people used to park on. The trees closed in thick on either side, and you could hear water running somewhere off in the dark, maybe a creek hidden down a slope. We stopped the car, turned off the engine, and for a second the silence was so heavy it was like cotton stuffed into your ears. My eyes took a moment to adjust, and in that silence, every little sound stood out. The creak of the cooling engine, a twig snapping deep in the woods, the faint rush of water below. We got out, stretching our stiff legs. The air was cooler, almost cold, with that damp smell of pine and soil. We flicked on our headlamps and started unloading, voices low without even meaning to lower them. There was a weird sense of being watched, not in a dramatic way, just in the way you feel when you know you're somewhere people don't usually show up at night. As we hauled out the packs, one of the beams of light swept across the tree line, and for just a second I thought I saw something move. Not a shape I could describe, not even an animal exactly, just a shift, a darker spot against the dark trees. I stopped, staring, my light fixed on the trunks, trying to see if it was just my eyes playing tricks. Nothing moved again. My friends were too busy shuffling gear to notice. I didn't say anything, partly because I didn't want to spook anyone and partly because I wasn't sure myself. We got the packs on and headed down the faint path from the pull-off. The trail was narrow and winding, roots catching underfoot, branches brushing our shoulders. The beams of our lamps jittered with every step, and the forest seemed to press in tighter the further we went. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something behind us, but every time it was just the bouncing cone of light on the trees and nothing else. It took us maybe 15 minutes to reach a small clearing near the creek. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and the trees opened up enough to give us space to set up the tents. We went about our routine, laying out ground tarps, sliding poles into fabric, staking things down. The ordinary motions were comforting, something to focus on. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. Once everything was up, we sat around with a couple of lanterns lit, eating the snacks we'd packed. The glow of the lights made a small circle of comfort, but just outside of that circle, the forest was pitch black. Every now and then I'd catch myself staring out past the light, into the dark where the trees stood silent. That sense of being observed kept pressing down. Later, when I got up to use the trees, I walked a little ways from camp. The creek was just barely visible in the dark, its surface catching faint glints of light from the stars. I turned my headlamp off for a moment, just to stand in the darkness and listen. That's when I heard it again. A crack of wood, faint but sharp. Not the kind of sound branches make swaying in the wind, but the distinct snap of weight pressing down. I froze. My breathing went shallow, ears straining. A few seconds later, another snap. Slow, deliberate. Something was moving out there. I turned the lamp back on, sweeping the beam over the undergrowth. Nothing, just the trees and the blackness between them. But the sound stuck with me, the knowledge that something had been close, moving carefully, slowly. I went back to camp quickly, not saying much. The others were already rolling into their sleeping bags, and I decided to do the same. Inside the tent, zipped up tight, the thin fabric didn't do much to block out the sounds of the forest. Every creak, every distant rustle seemed amplified. My heart thumped every time I thought I heard footsteps, slow and steady in the leaves. I told myself it was animals, deer or raccoons nosing around. But the sound didn't feel like animals. It felt heavier, measured. I barely slept that night, lying awake, staring at the nylon above me. At some point I drifted off, but not for long. When dawn finally came and the first gray light pushed into the clearing, I unzipped the tent and looked out. The forest looked ordinary again, calm and harmless. The air smelled fresh, the water sparkled in the creek. But when I walked over to the edge of the trees, I noticed something. A patch of ground where the pine needles had been scuffed away. The soil was disturbed, like someone had been standing there for a while, shifting their weight. It was angled directly toward our camp. I stood there a long time staring at that spot. Whoever it was, they hadn't come closer, hadn't done anything to us. They just watched. Whether it was another camper wary of strangers showing up at night, or someone with other intentions, I'll never know. But the thought that we'd been under someone's eyes that whole time made my stomach turn. We packed up quickly that morning and hiked out. The car was right where we'd left it, nothing touched. But as we drove back down the dirt road, I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see a figure watching from the trees. To this day, I can't decide which unsettles me more, that it was another camper just being cautious, or that it was someone else entirely. All I know is, I've never felt comfortable pulling up to a trailhead late at night again. You never really know who's already out there watching. I remember that night so clearly because of how quickly it went from calm and almost boring to one of the scariest things I've ever stumbled into. We were camping on a big piece of private property that someone in the group had access to. It wasn't thick forest like most people picture when they think of camping. This was more open country, rolling grassland hills with scattered trees, mostly oak and some scrub brush here and there. The kind of place where the horizon feels huge, where the sky takes up most of your view, especially at night. There were about a dozen of us all together. Earlier in the evening, we'd made a big fire, cooked food, and just sat around telling stories. It was one of those nights where the air was perfectly still, cool but not cold, and the only sounds came from the crackle of the fire and, every now and then, a coyote yipping way off in the distance. After a while, a few people decided to take a walk. They said they just wanted to stretch their legs, wander around in the moonlight for a bit. Nothing unusual. I stayed behind for a while with another friend. We sat by the fire, poking at the logs, talking in that kind of half-lazy, half-tired way that happens when the night drags on. But after maybe half an hour, we started wondering what was taking the others so long. They hadn't brought flashlights, and the landscape was easy enough to get turned around in once you went over a few hills. So we decided we'd go out and look for them. Not in a serious search and rescue way, just kind of bored curiosity mixed with wanting to stretch our own legs too. We didn't bring lights either because the moon was nearly full, and it was one of those nights where the ground and grass glowed faintly silver. You could see surprisingly far without artificial light. Everything was still, eerily still. Every footstep seemed louder than normal, and every time the wind stirred in the grass, it sounded like it was carrying farther than it should. We kept our voices down, mostly whispering. It wasn't that we thought we'd scare anything off. It was just the natural instinct when you're out in the quiet like that. After walking for a while over the slopes of the hills, we started scanning the crests, thinking we might spot silhouettes against the sky. That's when I saw it. On top of one of the hills, near the dark outline of a tree, I saw what looked like someone standing there. Just this upright figure, perfectly still. My first thought was that we'd found one of our friends. Maybe they were waiting for us, or maybe they were just standing around staring off at the horizon. It wasn't weird enough to set off alarm bells right away. I walked a little ahead of my friend, feeling sure of myself. As I got closer, though, I noticed something strange. The figure wasn't moving at all. No shifting, no turning of the head, no reaction when I got within calling distance. I whispered a quick hello at first. Nothing. I said it louder, still nothing. I felt irritation rise. Maybe they were messing with us, trying to spook us by staying silent. So I walked faster, striding up the hill. But as I came closer, things started to feel off. The way the arms were positioned didn't look right. They were stretched up, way higher than someone would normally hold them, almost as if both arms were raised over their head in a rigid, unnatural way. The proportions didn't make sense either. The body looked too narrow, and the stance was strange, not quite like a person just standing casually. All of this was registering in the back of my mind, but I didn't slow down until I got close enough to see the truth. It wasn't a person at all. It was a coyote, or at least it had been. Someone had strung it up against the tree, hanging it by its limbs so that it looked like it was standing upright. Its front legs were stretched high above, tied somehow to the branches, and its hind legs had been pulled taut so that the body was upright, suspended like some grotesque totem. The animal had been flayed, its fur peeled back, leaving muscle and sinew exposed. Its head lolled slightly, the jaw hanging open, teeth showing in a way that made it look like a sick grin. The sight hit me like a physical blow. My legs gave out, and I actually stumbled backward, falling onto the ground hard enough that the wind rushed out of me. My chest tightened so much I thought I was about to have a heart attack. For a split second, my mind couldn't even process what I was seeing. The silence around me made it worse, like the entire night had been holding its breath for me to reach this exact spot and discover this horror. When I scrambled back to my feet, I could barely look at it. The thing that had seemed like a person waiting for us on the hill was just this dead, mutilated animal. The moonlight gleamed off the raw, pale tissue where its skin had been stripped away. The longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. It wasn't just killed and left, it was displayed. Someone had gone to the trouble of tying it up like that, arranging it so that anyone who stumbled upon it would think it was human at first. That thought stuck with me. It was meant to be seen. Later, I learned the story. The woman who owned the property hated coyotes because they threatened her livestock. This was her land, and stringing them up like that was her way of making a statement. She wanted to send a warning to other coyotes, as ridiculous as that might sound to some people, and maybe also to anyone trespassing. But I didn't know that in the moment. In the moment, all I felt was the terror of stumbling onto something I wasn't supposed to see. It wasn't just the gore. It was the way the figure had tricked my brain into thinking it was human until I was almost close enough to touch it. It was the sense that the world wasn't as safe or simple as it had felt just 5 minutes earlier. I backed away from that hill, shaking so badly my knees almost gave out again. My friend had stopped farther down and hadn't seen it from up close, but the way I must have looked, pale and trembling, was enough for him to realize something wasn't right. I couldn't even explain right then. I just muttered that we needed to head back. When we finally returned to camp, I couldn't shake the image from my head. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, the sound of gunfire ripped through the silence. Fast, sharp cracks, at least 20 rounds in a row. I bolted upright, heart pounding, but no one else seemed too shocked. One of the people who had camped there before just mumbled that the landowner must have found a pack of coyotes and opened up on them with her rifle. They told me to go back to sleep like it was normal, but I couldn't. I just lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the echoes of those shots bouncing across the hills. The image of that strung-up coyote was burned into my brain. The way its shape had tricked me, the way my chest had clenched when the truth snapped into focus. That night changed something for me. I've done a lot of camping and hiking since, but I've never been able to shake the unease that comes when I see a strange silhouette in the distance. I always think about that moment, the realization that sometimes what you think is a person out there in the night is something else entirely, and sometimes it's something you really don't want to find. I used to have this group of friends who were all a little restless at night, the kind of kids who didn't want to just sit in somebody's basement playing video games until morning. We wanted to be outside, moving, pushing ourselves, making memories that felt bigger than just another Friday night. That's how Manhunt became our thing. It was basically hide-and-seek tag on steroids. A few people started off it, and everyone else scattered into the park to hide. If you got tagged, you joined the hunters until there were only 1 or 2 stragglers left, running for their lives. Then we'd reset and start again. We almost always played in the same park. It was a huge place, bigger than just a neighborhood patch of grass. There were trails winding through the woods, open fields with soccer goals, playgrounds, picnic shelters, and even an old stone pavilion on top of a hill that overlooked everything. The pavilion had these ridiculously long staircases leading up to it, the kind that made your legs ache just thinking about climbing them. That whole park turned into our stage. By day, it was full of families and joggers and people walking dogs. But at night, once the last car left the lot and the lamps came on, it became our place. The lamps didn't light everything evenly. Some areas glowed under the orange bulbs, but other spots, the trails especially, were swallowed in shadow. It gave us cover, made hiding more fun, but also gave the place a completely different energy. You couldn't shake the feeling that the woods pressed in closer at night. You could hear the rustling, the faint shift of branches, or the crunch of gravel under your own shoes echoing louder than it ever seemed to in daylight. On the night I'll never forget, I started out It was me, my buddy, and his younger brother. We split up at first but met again near the stairwell that led to the pavilion. It was one of those hot spots in the park where people always tried to tuck themselves away. The stairwell was long, steep, and wrapped in trees on both sides. It felt like a natural trap, so we figured we'd corner someone there. We started down slowly, scanning between the trees and under the stairs, trying to catch movement or a flash of clothing. We were halfway down when we spotted 2 figures way below us. At first, it was just silhouettes at the bottom of the hill, backlit faintly by the glow of a street lamp from a road that ran nearby. From where we stood, it looked exactly like 2 of our friends. Usually, when you spotted someone, the normal back and forth began. You'd yell out, they'd yell back, and then the chase would start. That's how the game always worked. But this time, it didn't go like that. The 3 of us raised our voices, loud enough to echo down the steps, expecting names or laughter or at least a taunt. Instead, a voice came back that didn't belong to anyone in our group. The words were harsh, almost spitting through the air. "Who the fuck are you?" That froze me. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. Aggressive, sharp, as if we'd intruded somewhere we didn't belong. We looked at each other, all 3 of us confused, but before I had time to process, instinct kicked in. We were already halfway down the stairs, and in the rush of adrenaline, we did the same thing we always did in the game. We charged. We sprinted down at them, thinking maybe it was just some messed up prank or our friends trying to scare us. But then, something shifted. The 2 figures didn't run away. They didn't scatter like people usually did when the game heated up. They ran toward us. That was the moment my gut turned cold. It didn't make sense. No one ever did that. The hairs on the back of my neck shot up like needles, and in a single silent agreement, we spun and bolted back up the stairs. The steps were uneven concrete, chipped at the edges, slippery with moss in spots. My shoes pounded so hard it felt like the stairs might break beneath me. My lungs started burning almost immediately, but adrenaline shoved everything else aside. I could hear my friend's younger brother gasping behind me, his feet slapping hard as he tried to keep up. I risked a glance back when we reached the top. I wish I hadn't. The two strangers were already halfway up, their pace impossibly fast. They'd closed the gap by a ridiculous margin. We had a head start and way more distance, but somehow they were only 10 feet away. That was what really broke me. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just some weird encounter. It was a threat. We didn't stop at the top. We tore across the pavilion field, the grass wet from dew, our shoes slipping as we tried to get traction. Every step felt like the ground wanted to pull me down, like gravity itself was conspiring to slow me. I forced my legs to move faster, arms pumping, lungs tearing apart inside my chest. Behind me, I could hear them, the crunch of their steps, steady and unrelenting. We aimed for the trail that circled the park. It was about 2 miles around, but it eventually came out onto a residential road where one of our friends lived. That house had become our unofficial checkpoint, the place we regrouped between rounds. The idea of making it there was the only thing keeping me moving. The trail was gravel and dirt, and every step sent tiny stones flying out beneath my shoes. The trees loomed on both sides, their branches arching overhead like they were trying to close us in. The air was damp, thick, and hard to breathe. My heart slammed in my chest, the sound so loud I couldn't even hear the night insects anymore. We pushed forward, but my body started to fail. My legs turned to fire, each stride heavier than the last. The distance was too much. My lungs couldn't keep up, but the thought of stopping, of letting those strangers close the last few feet, was worse than the burning. So I pushed harder, dragging myself forward. Every so often I forced myself to look back. Each time, the figures were still there, never gaining, never losing ground, just holding the same terrifying distance behind us. Their speed was unreal, their endurance relentless. By the time we neared the road, I was spent. My legs wobbled like they were ready to collapse under me. My chest was heaving so violently I thought I might black out. But the lights of the neighborhood finally broke through the trees, glowing like salvation. We stumbled out of the park, onto the asphalt, gasping, our sweat chilling in the night air. I turned back, expecting them to burst out of the trail after us. But there was nothing, just the dark opening of the park, silent and empty. They hadn't followed us out. They stopped somewhere back in those woods, like crossing into the neighborhood was a line they wouldn't cross. When we finally reached our friend's house, the rest of the group was sprawled out in the driveway, laughing and relaxed. They hadn't been playing at all. They'd left us to search the park while they hung out, planning to spook us when we gave up. We tried to explain, panting and shaky, what had just happened. Some of them laughed, thinking we were overreacting, while others frowned, uneasy, asking if maybe we just misheard or mistaken someone else for strangers. But there was no mistake. Those two weren't part of our group. Their voices weren't familiar, their speed wasn't normal, and the way they came at us wasn't playful. They weren't out there to join in some harmless game. We never figured out who they were. Nobody went back into the park that night. A few friends talked about checking it out, but the idea of stepping back into those woods in the dark was out of the question for me. Even now, I can still feel the echo of those footsteps chasing us, the impossible speed, the silence when we finally made it to safety. It wasn't just the fear of being chased. It was the realization that some people out there aren't playing games at all. They're waiting in the dark, and sometimes you don't realize it until they're right on your heels. That was the last night I ever played Manhunt.